This lecture is going to be on federalism, which is the form of government that we have in these United States. Federalism is defined as the sharing of power between the national and regional governments. Before the United States came into being, this form of government did not even exist. This is unique to us. Even though governments today have this, we were the first. Other systems of government, unitary systems, are systems of government in which the power is concentrated in one place, in the central government. Confederal systems, on the other hand, are systems of government in which the central government is very weak and most of the power is in the regional governments. Now, why do we have a federal system? Well, the federal systems, the founding fathers, I should say, were suspicious of power. They had just fought a war. They didn't want to centralize the government again. This was seen as a problem. And so they were wanting to divide the power to preserve liberty. And the way they thought they could preserve this liberty was to make it so that power was not concentrated in one place. So here's your definition of federalism when you are asked to give it. A system of government that divides power between a national government and regional governments. In our country, we call these regional governments states. In other countries, they may be called something else. Now, we have two different theories of federalism, the national theory and the compact theory. The national theory says our government was created by the people, of the people, by the people, for the people. This theory has been used to support the expansion of the powers of the national government, especially in the last century. The compact theory, on the other hand, says the federal government was brought into existence not by the people, but by the regional governments, by a compact among the sovereign states. And when you think about it, the colonies did come together and create the United States of America. Ronald Reagan has a famous quote in which he says, "The federal government did not create the states created the federal government." So, where is this balance between state power and central power? Well, this will define where you are on the balance beam when you think about that. Those who are on the right, and we call conservatives, Republicans, conservative Republicans, depending on how far to the right they are strong believers in states' rights. They believe that the states should have more rights and that the power should be located out at that end of the balance beam. Those on the left we call liberals or Democrats, and they believe in a strong national government, and they would like to see the balance of the power of government located more in the center and in the national government. So this is where we come up with the political parties and where they are, and you'll know that they're pretty consistent in their arguments about where power should be located. Now, how does the Constitution interact with this idea of federalism? Well, in the Constitution, we talk about vertical federalism, in which we are talking about what we were just talking about, the relationship between the federal government and the states. Where is the power? Where should the power be located? Horizontal federalism, on the other hand, talks about the relationship of the states with each other. And a good example of this is the full faith and credit clause in the Constitution, which says we accept each other's public acts, such as marriage and divorce, etc. And, you get married in one state, you're married in another state. And that is all well and good. Now we have this issue of gay marriage coming up, and so a lot of people, myself included, kind of wonder how this is going to affect this. How can you be married, say, in Vermont and you move to California and you're no longer married. Is this a problem? That's going to be for you to answer. Here again, this is one of the things that happens with federalism, and we sometimes have these conflicting laws between the states, and frequently it's up to the federal government to decide then what it is. I don't know where this is going to lead, but we will just have to play a wait and see. Privileges and immunities. Citizens have the same rights no matter what state they reside in. So we have this overarching thing that makes us a citizen of the United States, and then we live in these regional governments that sometimes disagree with each other. The Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, Article 6, Paragraph 2, states, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby." In other words, whenever state and federal laws conflict, the federal law is supreme. This is going to be interesting in California if we pass the medical marijuana law, or the marijuana, not medical marijuana, the marijuana law, and legalize marijuana, which a lot of people in this state want to do. So far it hasn't happened. It has failed, but one of these days it just might pass. Well, it's against the federal law to use and dispense and sell marijuana. So what are we going to do when California has a law that says marijuana is legal? The federal government has a law that says marijuana is not legal. This, again, will probably be in the courts. And remember, we said in the initial lecture, usually laws, policy is determined by your legislature. Sometimes it's decided by the courts, and this may be one of those examples where our policy will be determined by the court. Here is the hierarchy of authority. Who has the power? At the top of the list, of course, is the U.S. Constitution. Underneath it, you can see the laws and treaties, then Supreme Court decisions, administrative regulations. That's the bureaucracy. When we get to the bureaucracy, we'll talk about how they make some laws. Then we have the state constitution, state laws, state Supreme Court decisions, state appellate court decision, state administrative regulations, and then local ordinances. So there's your hierarchy of who has the final word on a given law or policy. Powers of the separate government. Now the Constitution is a beautifully written document. I hope someday you take the time to read it. It does not take that long to read. It is laid out beautifully, and you can find Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution gives some pretty specific items about who has the power to legislate and to make policy. And they make these distinctions based on 5 different types of powers: delegated powers, reserved powers, implied powers, prohibited, and concurrent. Delegated or expressed powers. Delegated powers are also known as expressed or enumerated powers. These are the powers that are granted to and exercised only by the national government. These include the power to coin money, power to enter into treaties with foreign governments, the power to regulate commerce with other nations and also between the states, to provide for the common defense and general welfare, and to declare war. Reserved powers. Reserved powers, in the 10th Amendment, it says, "The power not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states or to the people." These powers would include voting, public education, police powers, criminal laws, and the right to regulate commerce within the state. In other words, interstate commerce. And some people have a lot of problem with this. If states have the policy-making power of public education, then a lot of people want to know, why do we have a federal Department of Education? What are they there for? Why do they have any power, and why should they be telling the states what to do? Voting. We saw what happened in the election. You guys are probably too young to remember it, or some of you are, but in 2000 when Bush 2 and Al Gore were in the election, and the election actually had to go to the Supreme Court to determine who had won that. Well, if Florida makes up Florida's laws, and this is a national election, if the voting laws are determined by Florida, why was it that the Supreme Court of the United States could override the decision of the Supreme Court of Florida? All of these things show that, yes, this policy is out there, but it kind of gets muddy once you step into it. Implied powers. In 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland, a very famous case. The state of Maryland, the National Bank was located in the state of Maryland, and Maryland needed revenue, so they decided they wanted to tax the federal bank. The Supreme Court Justice at the time was Chief Justice John Marshall. He was our first Supreme Court Justice, and a very powerful man, and a believer in the national theory of federalism. And he enacted this, or he referred to the necessary and proper clause in Article 1 of the Constitution, and said we have to have a federal bank in order to carry out the duties of the national government. Therefore, this is an implied power. Just because it wasn't given in so many words in the Constitution doesn't mean that it isn't a power. So implied powers are those powers of the national government that flow from those powers that are enumerated. Prohibited powers. Those are powers that either the state government or the federal government or both of them cannot do. For example, state governments are prohibited from coining money. Only the federal government can coin money. Neither the federal nor the state can pass what's called ex post facto laws. Those are laws after the fact. If it's legal to do something today and they pass a law against it tomorrow, you cannot be held accountable or held delinquent because you did something prior to it becoming a law. No titles of nobility. We, unlike England, we don't have our celebrities being knighted and stuff like that. We don't have earls, etc. That is written into the Constitution that there are no titles of nobility. Concurrent powers are those that are exercised independently by both the national and the state governments. These would include the power to tax, the power to borrow money, and the power to regulate commerce within their own borders. This power to regulate commerce between the states, interstate commerce regulation, came about because of Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. This is a Supreme Court case that dealt with New York and New Jersey and a waterway between them, and who actually had the power to regulate that commerce. The Supreme Court at that time stepped in and said that they were the ones that had the power. Pros and cons of federalism. Federalism permits diversity and diffusion of power. There's lots of access points for us as citizens to participate in decision making in a democracy when we can participate at the state level as well as at the national level. There is, of course, less chance that individual rights will be abused because power is not concentrated in one place. Avenues for innovation. What this means is that the 50 states act like 50 laboratories of innovation. One state may have a good idea, it gets picked up by another state, and maybe even by the federal government. There is more than one way to solve individual problems. And finally, it suits a large country with a very diverse population, and we are large and diverse. Some of the cons of federalism is it has permitted discrimination, racial discrimination in the South especially, up through the 50s and the 60s. We had a lot, and we will talk in depth about that when we get to the chapter dealing with civil rights. Special interests in certain localities can frustrate national goals by becoming a block of protest in a certain policy. Local communities may lack the expertise. It seems like a lot of the really great talent floats to the federal government, and sometimes local communities don't have as much expertise as they need to handle the problems. And law enforcement and justice may be unevenly applied. We can look at the death penalty laws. When we look at the death penalty laws, for instance, in New York, if you commit murder, they do not have a death penalty. In California, we do have the death penalty. In Texas, they also have the death penalty, and people actually die. They are much more likely to die. Some people say that this is a problem because it's not equitable. Talk a little bit about the historical evolution of federalism. As I said, the Constitution was written in 1787 and signed in 1789. Over the years, the 200 and plus years since the American federal system has come into being, it has changed. The three major phases are the conflict phase, the cooperative phase, and new federalism. The conflict phase of federalism lasted from 1789 until the 1930s. The cooperative phase lasted from 1930s until 1979, and new federalism from 1980 until the present time, although some people would say we're actually in another phase now. The conflict phase of federalism began with the founding of the country and lasted until the Great Depression. At this time, the country was interested in defining its boundaries, and I don't mean their geographical boundaries, but where should the power be? How much power should the federal government have? How much power should the state government have? And so there was this constant conflict. McCulloch versus Maryland was one of the examples that I gave you earlier. Dillon's rule has to do with local governments and what power they have. And according to Judge John Dillon, local governments really don't have any power except the power that was given to them by the individual states. So Riverside has, the city of Riverside, has certain powers, but they only have the powers that have been expressly given to them by California, by the state of California. So within this period of time, up until the 1930s, these were the major questions that were coming before the Supreme Court. What happened, of course, when we had the Civil War was really a lot about, it was certainly about slavery, but it was also about federalism. Who had the power? The South said, we don't want to live here anymore. And the North said, well, you're going to live here. Look at the name that the South gave to himself. They were it was the Confederate Army. They wanted a Confederate form of government. They wanted to go back to that old way of deciding things. And the North, of course, was the Union, and this was major. Then the Great Depression came, and all of a sudden the states were confronted with things that they could not handle. The cooperative phase of federalism came in because of the Great Depression and the Second World War. These are major crises for our country. Economic distress, international threat, and during this period of federalism, up through from the 1930s up through the 1970s, you saw the balance of federalism move more and more to the center, to to the central government, I should say, more to the left and to the central government, where people were interested in what can the national government do for me. The Great Depression showed us that the states could not operate on their own, and of course the Second World War was a great centralizing force as well. After that, we had the civil rights issues. We had the states, as I mentioned before, abusing their power with racial discrimination, and the federal government had to step in again, and of course it stepped in again with the war on poverty. Part of this cooperative phase, it contains another phase that's in your textbook called the creative phase, and this was under Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson gave this name to federalism under his term in office, in which he was pouring lots of money into local and state governments for his war on poverty. And the new federalism is the one that came in under Ronald Reagan. And the new federalism is a reversal of this movement to the left that had come about from the 1930s to the 1970s. And this one is characterized by more of an emphasis on states' rights and states doing things for themselves. Federal aid is cut, and we have what is called devolution. And devolution means moving responsibility back to the states. And the way to do this is to say, you know what, states, you are responsible for yourself. We are not going to be giving you the money. You decide how you want to spend your own money and what policies you're going to have. And this also was followed with forced compliance with mandates for national policy objectives. One example of these mandates would be the legal age for alcohol. Legal age for alcohol consumption in this country is 21. Now, the reason this is a legal age across all 50 states, it used to be, a long time ago, every state decided what the legal age for drinking was. Well, the national government said, you know what, if you want to have money for your roads, if you want to have transportation funding, this is what you will put into place. That's called a mandate. And so that's why every state has the legal age of 21 now for alcohol consumption, so that they are eligible to get funds from the Department of Transportation to maintain their roads. Now we are in a phase, some people call it ad hoc federalism. It seems sometimes to be state-centered and sometimes to be nation-centered. Depends on your political or partisan convenience. For example, No Child Left Behind. This was under Bush. Bush was pretty much of a states' rights president, and yet he was, the No Child Left Behind was a national policy for education. Some people say he should have just left it all alone. After September 11th in 2001, which we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of, this is one of those great crises, sort of like the Civil War and the Great Depression, where the war on terror cannot be fought by individual states. It's going to take the national government and the state governments both to do this. One thing now, of course, we have the Great Recession. I have the dates listed here as 2008 to 2009. Here it is, 2011, and we are still pretty much in the recession. I don't know if we are technically in a recession still, but we are certainly in bad economic straits, and this again makes the states more dependent on the federal government. And so the results of this economic recession is going to be more and more dependence on the federal government.